we are going to get started. For about the first 30 minutes, I'm going to try to keep my voice down a little bit because there's First Communion classes going on right next door. But they are done at 7:30, so when they are done, I will be my normal, loud, boisterous self. Don't worry. Although maybe this is a good thing because, you know, the voice problems I've been having with laryngitis, if I keep my voice down for the first 30 minutes, and as usual, I'm sure more people will come wandering in as we after we get started here. But all right, so welcome to week 5. I promised last week that this was kind of the climax. If you think a high school English class, maybe middle, the one high school student in the room is like, oh no, school doesn't start for another couple of weeks. Please don't start talking about that now. Maybe it's even before I came, remember when I learned it. But you remember learning the story arc. We have like the rising action and the climax, and after the climax, there's a little bit of falling action. That's how we'll define this class. Today is the climax of the class, and next week is the falling action. So there's still another week left after this. But excuse me. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to follow, because the class was, based on Lee Strobel's works. I kind of wanted to follow his pattern and how he did things. And then kind of use the last week to insert a few extra things that maybe Lee Strobel didn't include in his works. Primarily, I wouldn't feel right having a class like this without talking about what is probably the number one objection that is raised to Christianity. The number one obstacle to a lot of people coming to faith is actually the problem of evil. It's, how can there be a good God when there's so much pain and suffering in the world? That you hear that more than anything else. And so we're going to talk about that next week, but before we get to that, we're going to talk about one more argument for the existence of God. If you remember, the first couple of weeks we were focused primarily on God in general, the Christian God and the existence of the Christian God, and then we've kind of narrowed our focus as we worked our way through the class to the person of Christ individually. Well, we're going to go back next week to God generally, because you need to understand the moral argument that to show the existence of God actually provides the answer or the foundation for an answer to the problem of evil. And so kind of, before you address the problem of evil, you first have to know the moral argument. So we're going to tackle both of those next week. But tonight, we are going to be talking about the resurrection, the whole class in one resurrection. And again, if you remember, 2 weeks ago, I had in your materials the 12-step approach to Christianity, to demonstrating Christianity that the classical apologists like myself tend to follow. And last week, what we were focusing on were steps 7, 8, and 9. 7 saying in the New Testament documents Jesus claimed to be God. And last week we went through a lot of scriptural support to show that, this is actually, Jesus was saying he was God. And then we talked about that sometimes what we see throughout the scriptures is that when God wants to communicate that, yes, this message really is from me, then what he would do is he would confirm it with a miracle. All right? You would know that it actually was from God because it would be accompanied by some particular, like think of Moses when he went to go see Pharaoh, okay? And, he's saying, let my people go. Well, how do we know this is really God saying, let my people go? Well, he does a number of miracles in order to prove it. And, of course, Pharaoh's magicians tried to duplicate it, and not with a whole lot of success, particularly speaking. And so God does that. And what we talked about is last week, we did talk about some miracles that Jesus performed during his lifetime that served to confirm that he was who he said he was. When he was saying he was God, when he was saying he was the Son of Man, when he was saying he was the Messiah, that he performed miracles to confirm that. But I promised that the one big miracle, the granddaddy of all miracles, obviously is his own personal resurrection, right? I mean, that's what our faith is built on. And so in a real sense, we're still kind of looking at step 8 here tonight. Jesus' claims to be God were confirmed by a unique set of miracles, but we're piling on from what we talked about last week. Now we're going to look at the granddaddy of them all. And what I mentioned before is that I find it interesting, to say the least, that out of all the miracles that have strong historical support, the one that I think has the most historical support by far is the one that turns out to be the most significant, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so we're going to talk a little bit tonight about how we look at this from a historical perspective and what evidence there is there to say, yeah, this event actually occurred. And so we're going to put on our historian hat again today, and we're going to try to look at things from the perspective of a historian. And these rules that we're talking about largely are rules you could use to evaluate any event in history. All right? If you want to figure out if George Washington chopped down a cherry tree, all right, then you're going to use some of these same rules that we're going to be talking about tonight to figure out if Jesus rose from the dead. Anybody know whether George Washington actually ever did actually chop down a cherry tree? No, he didn't. That's folklore, because there's not a lot of historical support for it. So it provides a very good contrast to what we're going to be talking about tonight. We are going to be following the same basic model we've been following, where there's a video where we're going to be watching an excerpt from the Case for Christ documentary. It's about, I think tonight's is about 21 minutes long. But before we get to that, I want to mention something to you, one quick lesson before we dive into that, because it doesn't really cover it in the video, and I think it's helpful to know this going in. All right? We've talked about in previous weeks about ways that you can look at a historical document generally and figure out, is this document generally reliable for us to, from which we can pull reliable historical information? And we talked about looking at things about, well, obviously it was written, in the case of the Gospels, they were written either by eyewitnesses or people who learned directly from eyewitnesses. We talked about the gap in time. You want to look at how much time elapsed between when the document was written down. We talked about oral tradition. Remember, we talked a little bit about, how did the culture have a system in place to accurately pass information down orally between the time the events happened and the time when they were actually put down to written form? And then we talked about, do we even have accurate copies of what was originally written? And we talked about the whole field of textual criticism about, how close and how many manuscripts do we have? How close in time is the oldest manuscript to the original writing? Things like that. But now what I want to focus on very briefly is, even if we have a document that is overall, we can look at it and say this is generally a reliable document, what about individual pieces of information within that document, and how do we evaluate individual claims? Because it's possible you could have a historian who's generally quite reliable, but then says something that's completely out of left field. Maybe they're writing about something that they're not particularly interested in, and then they have to write something about their dear best friend Bud, and they don't want to make their dear best friend Bud look bad, so they maybe embellish things a little bit about Bud. All right. So how do we look at the individual claims within it and figure out whether those individual claims are most likely to be reliable? Well, there are a number of factors that historians will use to do that, and probably the three biggest are the ones that I've got on the screen. One is early attestation, all right? When you're looking at an individual claim, when somebody's saying this happened in history, how close in time to the event is it when we first see that claim being made? If someone says something happened, but the first record we have of somebody claiming it happened is 500 years after the fact, then it's reasonable to assume that in that 500-year gap, there could have been legendary development. In other words, stories could have developed over time that kind of embellish what really happened. And so the closer in time to the actual events that when they're first recorded, the more likely they are to be true. And keep in mind, these are kind of cumulative approaches. It's not like any one factor here in and of itself is absolutely conclusive that it's true, but the more of these that you can find, the more likely an event is to be authentic. The second criteria is multiple attestation. How many people said it? How many people said it? If it's something that was just said by one person, well, that one person could have been protecting their best friend Bud. Whereas if it was mentioned by 4 or 5 different people, well, they're not all best friends with Bud, okay? So that tends to make it more likely to be true because it was attested multiple times by multiple witnesses. A third one, and this one's really important, is the criteria of embarrassment. This one, as you'll see as we work through tonight, plays a big role in the evidence for the resurrection, all right? People don't generally like to admit things that make them look bad. And so if they do admit something that makes them look bad, it's probably true, because they'd have no motive to do it otherwise. Or if they're admitting something that makes it less likely that you're going to believe them. All right? If I were to stand up in front of you and and list off to you every single sin that I've committed in my life. And I say this because I'm reasonably confident that I'm not the only sinner in the room. That, I'm not going to make up sins. Why would I do that? I'm not going to say I did something that I didn't really do, because every single one I list off is going to have you cringing even more in your seat and thinking, why the heck is he up there teaching this class? Oh my gosh, I want to leave the room now. No, there's nothing really that bad. Okay. I haven't killed anybody that I know of. No. Maybe a couple spiders on behalf of my wife, but, that's because my marriage depends on me getting rid of the spiders in the house. It's absolutely necessary. So that criteria of embarrassment is one of the most important factors when we're looking at individual claims to figure out whether they're most likely to be true or not. So early attestation, multiple attestation, and the criteria of embarrassment. I want you to keep those three things in mind as you're listening to them explain some of the evidence for the resurrection in the video we're about to watch. All right? So we will go ahead and we will watch tonight's video. All right. Got everything going? Yeah. I want to, real quick, before we dive into the rest of this, say something about that last point that was made by N.T. Wright. That was the last gentleman you saw there on the screen. And this is kind of a throwback reminder to one thing we talked about last week. And if anybody wasn't here, remember, these are all on YouTube, so you can catch up if you want to on the Trinity Joppa channel. And they're not going anywhere. Even after the class is over, we're going to leave them up. So he said that, if somebody wants to, set their entire worldview around the concept that, the dead people can't come back to life, then that's fine. I can't stop. I mean, he's right. You can't stop. People are going to believe what they want to believe. But remember, we did look at one of the more famous arguments against miracles last week from David Hume. And we talked about how that argument didn't hold up, where he tried to say remember I said that he would be the best friend of every lottery commissioner out there, because he tried to argue from the premise that, the evidence for the regular is always greater than the evidence for the rare. And we said, well, no, that's not necessarily true. And so I just wanted to throw that out there as a reminder that, yeah, people can believe that if they want, that these things just can't happen. But when even the brightest of skeptical philosophers have tried to actually take that belief and organize it in a logical argument, they failed. All right, so that in and of itself should tell you something. All right, so what we're going to talk about, they kind of threw a lot of evidence at you, and we're going to do what we usually do, is we're going to dig deeper, but I'm going to try to take everything that they threw at you and more, but put it in a structure that makes it easy to understand, easy to follow, so you can see where it leads to, all right? And what the key phrase here is the minimal facts approach. They didn't actually use it in the documentary there at all, but what apologists refer to this as is the minimal facts approach to demonstrating the resurrection, or the minimal facts argument. And what it says is there is a set of minimal facts, just bare basic facts, that the overwhelming majority of historians agree upon, all right? Now, granted, the resurrection isn't one of them. You're not going to go around to a bunch of, skeptical historians and have them say, yes, I believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So we're not going to go that far. But what we do is say, what do they acknowledge? What events do they acknowledge are most likely to be historical? And then we take a look at those events and say, based on those events alone, can we demonstrate that the resurrection actually occurred? And I know I promised that we're done with science, and we're not actually doing science, but I am going to ask you to remember something we talked about in one of those science classes, all right? Remember we talked about black holes, and we talked about something called inference to the best explanation. And because a lot of people will charge Christians or Christianity what's called God of the gaps, where they say we have a gap in our knowledge, and you're just automatically inserting God as a kind of an ad hoc explanation. And I said, well, no, that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is what's called inference to the best explanation. You take a series of facts that you do know, and you look at them and say, well, what could best explain those facts? And this type of thing is done all the time. And one example I gave you was in black holes. You cannot directly detect the existence of a black hole. Dark matter was another one we talked about. But you figure out that a black hole exists based upon the effects you see around it. You see all these things happening in space, all right? And in order that you say, okay, what best explains all of these things? We know these things are happening. We don't know why, maybe. So what's the best explanation for what could be causing all of these things to happen? And from that, that's how scientists conclude the existence of black holes. We can't see them, but we can see the effects that they've caused. And from those effects, we can conclude that they are most likely there. It's the same type of reasoning here. We're going to take a look at those minimal facts, and that everybody agrees are out there, not everybody, but the majority of historians, overwhelming majority agree are true, and say, okay, now what's the best explanation for those facts? If we start with that, that is our starting point. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm going to talk to you first of all, because I know we have more slides tonight than any other night. You've got all the materials. I don't know if we're going to get through it all in the time we've got left. We're going to try, but in case we don't, I want to at least start with what the facts are. All right, so the four minimal facts that are most commonly used in this argument, that most historians, skeptical and Christian alike, agree these are most likely to be true. Number one, Jesus died by crucifixion. In other words, not just that he was crucified, but that he died as a result. All right. Number two, he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Some people say he was buried in a known location, but that's the point, is that they knew where his tomb was, and it was in this particular gentleman's tomb. Number three, on the third day, the tomb was empty. On that Easter Sunday, it was in fact empty. All right? And number four, on multiple occasions and under different circumstances, different people and groups of people genuinely believed they encountered the risen Jesus. All right? Keep in mind, that last one's not going so far as to say they actually did. It's just saying that they genuinely believed it. And this happened both to individuals and to larger groups en masse. Or you would have a whole group of people who all at the same time would be saying and believing that they saw Jesus all at once. Now, the way this works, the way the argument structure works, is you look at those facts and you ask yourself, well, what explains them? Now, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Jesus was risen from the dead, that he actually did come back to life. Now compare that theory, that possible explanation, to those four facts. Does it adequately explain those four facts? Would all those four facts be true if Jesus, in fact, did rise from the dead? Yes. All right, you can see very easily where that would fit those four facts. And that's the same methodology you would use with any other potential explanation that someone comes up with. And we're going to look at a couple of those tonight, so I'm not going to spoil it for you right now. But if they come up with other theories, then you just look down the list and say, okay, well, if you're saying that's what really happened, well, let's look at our foundational facts here, our minimal facts, and say, do any of these facts give you problems? Do you fail to explain any of these facts, or do any of these facts contradict your version? And we'll see how that plays out a little bit tonight. All right? And that was what this slide says right here, I just said. Sometimes I write these things up far enough ahead of time, I forget that I actually have a slide for something. I just keep right on going. But everything I just said, pretend this slide was showing while I was saying that. Okay, there you go. You all get the slides in front of me. If I start doing that and I haven't flipped, somebody just peg me with a cookie or something, right? I know it's a waste of a perfectly good cookie, isn't it? I don't think it's a waste. I'd eat it. All right. So what I want to do now is I want to take a look at those four facts individually, because I know when I first heard this argument, when I was just getting started in apologetics, for those of you that, I think I kind of gave you my story in class one. Not everybody might have been here, you might not remember, but I'm a lawyer, and I went to law school, and that's kind of when I came out of law school, it's kind of when I started on this journey, because I learned to cross-examine and to look for evidence, and that's kind of what my brain, the way it was wired. And so when I first heard this argument, I just kind of heard it to the extent you have now. I heard that there were these facts, and they're agreed upon by the majority of historians. And so I went out thinking, oh, okay, I'm ready, armed and ready to go, until I came across my first skeptic who didn't agree with the majority of historians, all right? And you're going to come across those. And so then I started thinking, well, wait a minute, I just realized, it for some reason, it never occurred to me that I never actually looked at the four facts and said, well, why do the majority of historians accept these facts? All right, and that's when I started getting into what I opened up this class with, those, multiple attestation, early attestation, criteria of embarrassment, things like that. You start to look at it from that perspective. And so what I want to do is I want to look at these four facts individually and explain why do historians, the majority of historians, find them to be reliable, most likely to be true. And as we do that, we'll also confront some of these alternative explanations that people have tried to put out there and see if they really hold up or not. All right? So the first one, Jesus died by crucifixion. First of all, we have multiple attestation of that. Now, one thing I want to make sure we mention, and this is a prejudice that a lot of people have going into this, understand that we talk about the Bible, right? And we all, anybody have their Bible? You got your Bible with you tonight. I see it sitting right there. And you pick it up, and it's one book, right? No, it's not, okay? It's one book now because it's been compiled that way. But back when it was first written, it was not, all right? And even if we're just talking about the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, those are 4 different books written by 4 different authors. So if you have an event that is attested, that's written about in all 4 of those Gospels, that's 4 different people all saying this event happened. And one objection I get a lot is people will say, well, but they're biased. I mean, these are Christian authors, so we can't really take the word for it from somebody who's a Christian author because they have an agenda, so to speak. Well, sometimes I humor them, and in this case we can. We'll talk about it in a little bit. There's Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, and Tacitus, a Roman historian, who both agree with this fact. But think about that for a second. Just think rationally for a second. Let's pretend that you really did see, you'd followed Jesus around for 3 years, and you saw him die, you saw the body, and then on the 3rd day, you saw him alive again. Don't you think if those events really occurred and you really were an eyewitness to them, that maybe you just might be inclined to believe he really was the Son of God like he said he was? I mean, the idea that we're going to exclude these people because they're Christian is basically saying we want to exclude anybody from telling us these events really occurred if they actually believe these events really occurred. I mean, so you want the least reliable sources you can have before you'll believe everything. Is that what you want? I mean, it makes no sense. Of course, people who really saw these things might be more likely to become Christian as a result. All right? And so that's kind of an irrational basis that a lot of people use. They say, well, you got an agenda. Well, no, not. And it's also not true, as we'll see in a little bit. If anything, the early Christians had a very strong incentive to deny these events occurred based on what was going on in their lives. But we do have multiple attestation that Jesus died from crucifixion, not just in all 4 Gospels, but also, like I said, there's Jewish historian Josephus, Roman historian Tacitus also agreed that this event actually did occur. The documentary mentioned 1 Corinthians 15. I've got verses 3 through 8 on the screen. This is probably, as an apologist, when I'm getting into these historical discussions, all right, about who the historical Jesus was and all of this, this is my best friend in the world. And people don't realize it. And you don't realize how significant this passage is. It's one of the most significant passages in the entire New Testament. Now, this is a letter written by Paul to the church in Corinth, and it was written somewhere around the 50s AD, approximately. But what's significant about it is it's a creed. Now imagine for a second, and you could probably hear, if I were to sit up here talking in my normal tone, in my normal voice, my normal intonations, word choice, and then all of a sudden I say, I believe in God the Father Almighty, the creator of heaven and earth, and his only Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. You can tell there was a shift there, can't you? There was a shift in my tone. What did I do?
Recited.
I started reciting a creed, right? And you can tell that just by the way I was speaking, because all of a sudden I wasn't sounding like Ken anymore. I was sounding like I was reciting something. That's what happens here. You don't get that in English, all right? But keep in mind, it wasn't originally written in English. It was written in Greek. And in the Greek, you can see that. As a matter of fact, what a lot of people do when they're trying to figure out whether somebody actually wrote a book in the New Testament is they will compare writing styles. You know, if we want to figure out, well, if we know Paul wrote this book and we want to decide whether or not Paul wrote this other book, we're going to look at the writing style of Paul and see if it seems to match up. That's a somewhat flawed methodology, in my opinion, because, I mean, case in point, if you look at something that I wrote 20 years ago and look at something that I write today, they're not going to read the same way. You know, I mean, my writing style evolves over time, so did, Paul's. But still, it's one criteria they look at. But within the same book, your writing style is not going to change. So when it does, when you have that shift in tone, you can tell that Paul's quoting something. And that's what happens here. He slips into a creed, something that was taught to the early Christians the same way we're taught creeds today to help them recite the essentials of their belief. All right? take a look at what Paul says here. He says, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. And last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born." All right. Keep in mind, all of the Gospels are written in the first century. All right. But this is actually the earliest source to demonstrate a Christian belief. This predates any of the Gospels. Because what it is, as Paul is saying, I'm passing on to you what was passed on to me. Well, then we look and say, well, passed on to him when? And you start to look at the other historical documents to kind of trace Paul's journeys, and you realize, oh, this is something that was most likely given to him when he first went to Jerusalem, right, after becoming a believer. And I don't know if you remember the story, but basically he goes to the church in Jerusalem, and they don't believe him. I mean, here's this guy that's been persecuting Christians, and the early church is like, no, we're not going to meet with him. Are you kidding? This guy that's been persecuting everybody out there? No. And so it takes convincing before they'll actually welcome him in and realize, no, he really did see Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he really has come around, so to speak. And so you look back and you realize, oh, so Paul got this creed. If it was passed on to him, it had to be passed on to someone who was a Christian before him, all right? Well, who would that be? Well, that would be the people, Peter and everybody he met with in Jerusalem. When did that event happen? We look to see when that event happened. It obviously had to be before he wrote this, right? And you backtrack it and realize that this dates to, I think they said on the documentary, to within like 3 to 5 years after Jesus' death. I've seen some estimate like up to 7 to 8 years. But the point is, this is really early, all right, really early evidence of what the early church believed, all right? For our purposes, and we'll kind of revisit this a few times throughout the night because this is such an important piece of historical evidence, but includes the fact that Jesus died, doesn't it? And so we can show, even within just a few years of Jesus' death, this first foundational fact is being spread around the Christian church, that he did in fact die. It also, incidentally, provides early evidence of just about the entire gospel in there, if you look at it. We've talked a little bit about this suggestion that maybe some of the ideas about Jesus evolved over time. Some critics claim that the early church didn't have as high regard for Jesus and didn't think all these things about him actually rising and coming back from the dead and all that. They just thought he was a good moral teacher. But then over time, this idea of him being God and coming back to life, that all evolved over the course of the next 100 years or so. Well, except for the fact that here we have evidence within the first 2 to 7 years at most after the resurrection or after the crucifixion that the Christian church already believed he did come back to life. All right, so that kind of refutes that. This wasn't some legend that evolved over time. This was what the Christians believed right from the get-go. Looking at the same fact now from the criteria of embarrassment, this is from Deuteronomy chapter 21. Take a look at what the Jewish people felt about people who were crucified. All right, who died in such a manner. And keep in mind, we always think of Jesus' crucifixion as being on the wooden cross, which it was. And we know that in his event because he had to carry the cross and all that. That's not always the way it was done. Sometimes crucifixions were carried out by literally hanging people on trees, whatever was available. There's a tree there, we'll nail you to a tree, all right? And here's what the law of Deuteronomy says. If someone guilty of a capital offense is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole or a tree, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it that same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Imagine for a moment that you're going to make up a story about somebody that you're claiming was the Messiah, who was the Son of God, who came back to life, who we should all be following. Are you going to make up a story that has him dying in such a way that he was under God's curse? You're trying to convince people that God's put his seal of approval on this guy, and instead, we're going to have him die in such a way that he's under God's curse. Now, looking back on it now after the fact, we know why he died under God's curse. And there goes the voice again. See, I think it's like some kind of summer allergies I got going on. I feel fine, trust me. I just can't talk. Because he was bearing our sins, right? And so that's the whole point, is he had our sins were placed upon him. He died for our sins. Therefore, he was under God's curse. That's why he died in that method. But this certainly didn't make them more likely to be believed by the Jews of their day. If anything, it made it less likely that Jews would believe their story. So this is not something they're going to make up. There are other belief systems, for example, Islam, that denies that Jesus actually died on the cross. Well, we've seen that some of the historical evidence here doesn't support that, all right? You've got Christian, Jewish, and Roman sources all agreeing that he did. In regard to, I promise you we talked about those Jewish and Roman sources. Josephus, we've talked about him a little bit in this class. Josephus, in his work Antiquities of the Jews, this was written about 94 AD, wrote the following about Jesus. It says, Pilate condemned him to death by crucifixion. Now, you may remember, and I don't remember which class it was now, they're all running together, but at some point we talked about the fact that there was a passage in Josephus that was disputed. Because what happened is over time, when the Christian church got political power, that they had control of these documents. And one thing that is pretty much indisputable is that they altered them, unfortunately. Remember what I said at the beginning of the class? I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one in here that hasn't sinned, that sinned before. So did every Christian from the dawn of time has been guilty of it. And this is something they shouldn't have done. It actually hurts our case in the long run, but they did alter it. And they altered the passage to add certain things to it. And they added things that made it look like Josephus was making very clear claims of Jesus as Messiah. Abundantly clear he was not, especially if you read the rest of his works. Okay, he did not think Jesus was the Messiah. However, there are other copies out there that have been found of Josephus's works that don't have these additions in them. And so we can compare the two and figure out what they actually added and what was true to the original. And this particular passage is agreed upon by most historians. It's generally agreed that this is genuine. All right, this part of it is correct. Josephus did at least confirm that Jesus was killed by Pilate and he was sentenced to crucifixion. But even if you don't like Josephus, we can look at the Roman historian Tacitus, who not too much later wrote his work called Annals. And here's what he wrote. He wrote, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, the name of Christianity, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Excuse me. So, first of all, it's funny to say Christus, from whom the name had its origin. The early Christian church they weren't called Christians. Anybody know what they were called originally? It has nothing to do with the class tonight. It's just a neat little historical tidbit. Originally referred to as the Way. It was called the Way. The idea of Christian, calling them Christian, actually was, a lot of people will say that was more of a derogatory term that was cast at them. And then over time, that came to be the accepted term. So anyway, that has nothing to do with anything we're talking about tonight, but it's just kind of a neat little thing. But here we have Tacitus saying that under Pontius Pilate, Jesus Christ suffered the extreme penalty. What was the extreme penalty under Roman rule? Crucifixion. Right, exactly. So even if you don't want to accept all four gospel writers separately writing this event happened, even if you don't want to accept Josephus saying this event happened, we've got a pretty clear and unimpeachable testimony from Tacitus saying it happened as well. Now, I promise that as we go through here, we talk about some of these other theories, all right? One theory that I got to be honest, you'll see a lot on the internet, but you won't see a lot in scholarly works anymore, all right? Not that it found its origin there, but it's really not accepted on the scholarly level anymore. It's what's called the swoon theory. The swoon theory is that, yeah, Jesus was sentenced to crucifixion. Yeah, Jesus was put on the cross, but he didn't actually die. He survived. And so when the apostles later see him alive, they genuinely believe they saw the risen Christ, all right? But they didn't. They saw a Jesus who had never actually died in the first place. Well, we'll get into that, the merits of that in just a second. But remember we talked about the methodology. You look down your four minimal facts, and say, okay, well, this is saying that he didn't actually die on the cross, and so what they saw was just a Jesus who survived crucifixion. Does that fit all four minimal facts? No. The first minimal fact is he died, all right, directly contradicts this theory. So that's how you use this methodology to look at these alternative views and say, do they actually hold up? They have to explain all four facts. This one doesn't. It directly contradicts the first. And there's a good reason why scholars agree to that first fact and don't accept this theory. Now, generally, the form this takes is one of two ways. They'll either claim that Jesus wasn't on the cross long enough to die, or they'll claim that, remember, he was given a drink while he was up there? I thirst and all that. They'll try to say that he was given at that point, somebody slipped him a drug that simulated death, but he didn't actually die. All right, that's generally, if somebody even gets more specific, that's the way they go about it. Now, here's the problem, and I will warn you about what's coming. I don't have any graphic pictures, nothing like that, all right? But we got to talk about some pretty graphic stuff, because we're going to talk about what happened to Jesus before he ever hung on the cross. All right, you cannot view the cross in isolation, because that's not all that happened to him that day. And we're not even going to talk about everything. We're just going to talk about one of the most severe things that happened to him. On the screen is a picture of a flagrum. A flagrum was a whip that was used in scourging in the Roman Empire. It had 3 or more leather tails that would have small metal balls or sheep bones at the end of each tail. Stephanie's already squirming in her seat over there. I know. We'll move on to the next slide. You don't have to look at that anymore, okay? This is a quote from a book called The Cross and the Shroud that describes what happened to Jesus when he was scourged. The weight of the metal or bone objects at the end of the leather thongs would carry them to the front of the body as well as to the back and arms, the shoulders, arms, and legs, to and including the calves. The bits of metal would dig deep into the flesh, ripping small blood vessels, nerves, muscles, and skin. If anybody's ever seen The Passion of the Christ, it's one of the most disturbing scenes to watch because they don't hold back on showing exactly what this was like. Dr. Alexander Metherell, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that, he was actually interviewed. He wasn't on the documentary here, but he is interviewed in the book, The Case for Christ. And if anybody's seen the movie, you know, it's not really him, it's an actor playing him, but there is a scene in the movie, The Case for Christ, that came out earlier, was it earlier this year, last year? No, I can't even remember now, where they do kind of depict this conversation. But he explains that Jesus would have gone into hypovolemic shock due to extreme blood loss. His heart would have been racing as it attempted to pump more blood to make up for the blood that was gone. He would have had a severe drop in his blood pressure, his kidney malfunction, and extreme thirst. And as Dr. Metherell says, there is no doubt that Jesus was already in serious to critical condition even before the nails were driven through his hands and feet. So understand that it wasn't just being nailed on the cross. You've got to keep in mind the condition he was in to begin with. Many people sometimes would die just from the scourging alone. They might not even make it to the cross. And remember what happened when Jesus was trying to carry his cross out to Golgotha. Did he make it? What happened?
He was too weak.
He was too weak. So then what happened? What'd they do?
Cyrus carried it.
Simon of Cyrene had to pick it up and carry it for him. That also tells you about what kind of condition he was in already before he even got to the cross. All right? Now, how about this whole objection that he wasn't on the cross long enough? Well, it kind of goes without saying, or at least it should, that the amount of time you're going to survive on the cross probably has something to do with what your condition is when you first get there, doesn't it? There's an inverse relationship there. The weaker you are to begin with, the less amount of time you're probably going to survive. The better condition you're in, the longer amount of time you're going to survive. And in reality, people would last anywhere from 3 to 4 hours up to 3 to 4 days on the cross, depending on what happened to them beforehand. So that's everything that happened beforehand. Let's talk about the crucifixion itself now for a minute. Does anybody know if someone was crucified, what it was that they actually died from?
Suffocation.
Suffocation, exactly. Asphyxiation, very good. You want to come up here? You've done your homework already. You can do that. Okay. William Lane Craig, who was one of the professors you saw on, he's from Biola University. You saw him on the, he was on one of the earlier documentaries. He was on this one. He's going to be on next week's as well, video, because he, in my estimation, he's probably the best, the brightest apologist out there today, but I'm biased somewhat. Not everybody agrees with me on that, but I think everybody would put him in their top 5. Here's how he explains what happens with one typo. Ignore that, that's cavity, not cavoti. I don't know what that's going on there, I didn't catch that one. As the victim hangs on the cross, his lung cavity collapses so that he can no longer exhale. In order to breathe, he must pull himself up on those nail-pierced hands and push with his feet until he can catch a breath. He cannot remain in this position for long, so he has to let himself drop back down. So as you're hanging there, you can't breathe, all right, when you're hanging down. And so you've got to push yourself up in order to make it so you can breathe. But how are you doing that? You're pulling up on these nails in your hands or wrists and your feet. That's excruciatingly painful. Where's the word excruciating come from? It comes from the crucifixion, all right? That's where that word comes from. And so you can't hold that position. And so you have to let yourself down. But now you can't breathe. So now you got to push yourself back up. But that's too painful. So now you're back down. But now you can't breathe. And eventually you get too weak. And you can't keep pushing yourself back up. And you die of asphyxiation. You suffocate. It's a slow, torturous, painful death. And you can also see how someone who was already in serious to critical condition going in is not going to be able to survive that very long at all, because they can't be pushing themselves up. They can't do it. They don't have. If Jesus didn't even have the strength to carry his cross to Golgotha, he's not going to have the strength to keep pushing himself up forever and ever and ever. So the idea that there wasn't enough time for him to actually die is ridiculous. It's ridiculous. What about this idea that he could have been given a drug mixed with a drink that he was given that only simulated death? Well, keep in mind, we already know everything that's happened to him up to this point. So it's mind-boggling that even if he was given a drug that stimulated death, that he wasn't going to die anyway. All right? But who gave him that drink?
Centurion.
The Roman centurion gave him that drink. A Roman centurion whose job it was to make sure he died. And if they didn't do that job, that Roman centurion probably was going to die. All right?
Didn't he refuse it, though?
I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to look back at the scriptures to answer that for sure.
I thought he
turned away
refused.
from it.
He turned away. Does it say he actually turned away, refused? I don't know. But even if, let's play skeptic for a minute, all right? And let's say, even if it says he turned away and he refused it, they'll say, well, no, that's just your, again, the best friend Bud scenario, where your gospel writer's trying to make him look good, but he really took it, and it simulated death, and that's all that really happened. Even if you don't, I mean, it just defies logic. Even if you want to say, well, we also think the best friend Bud scenario explains the fact that the Bible says it was a Roman centurion. We think it was really John who was there at the foot of the cross who gave it to him. Really? Do you really think a Roman centurion is going to look at, as John's trying to come up there to a man hanging on the cross, say, yeah, come on, go ahead, go say hi to your friend? Heck no! There's no way John's getting anywhere near him, all right? So the whole theory is ridiculous to begin with, all right? Michael Green from The Empty Cross of Jesus said, had the governor made a mistake over the execution of the messianic pretender, their jobs and probably their lives would have been on the line, all right? So it's a ridiculous theory. And even if it did happen, based on what we know medically, he wasn't living anyway, all right? Here's another really interesting confirmation, a small little detail about a lot of people don't even think about that's in the Bible. John 19:34. One of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. What's that? Well, remember before I said that Jesus was probably in hypovolemic shock. What that is he's got the rapid heartbeat trying to pump blood that's not there in order to get enough blood in there. It causes fluid buildup around the heart and around the lungs. It can actually rupture your heart, all right? So when the centurion stabs him and out comes blood, but also comes water, that provides medical evidence that he was in hypovolemic shock. It makes perfect sense. That water coming out is that fluid that's building up around his heart. All right? Guess what? He was dead. He was dead. We have more medical evidence of it. Here's the other funny thing about it. Can you imagine, even if we forget all of this stuff and we think that Jesus really did somehow survive this whole transaction, what's he going to look like? I mean, I didn't even mention the fact that he was in the tomb until Sunday, all right? Hasn't been eaten for the last 2 days after all of this, stuck behind a rock, all right? If you're a disciple and you see this guy who's been through all of this somehow getting out of that tomb, are you going to bow down and worship him, or are you going to try to get him medical attention? I mean, seriously, are you going to think for 1 second this is a guy who came back to life from the dead? Or are you going to think this is a guy who's on death's doorstep and needs to get attention immediately? There's no way they would be mistaking this for a risen Christ. All right, it doesn't make any sense. Another quote from Dr. Metherell. After suffering that horrible trauma with all the catastrophic blood loss and trauma, he would have looked so pitiful the disciples would never have hailed him as a victorious conqueror of death. They would have felt sorry for him and tried to nurse him back to health. So, that's just the first fact, all right? Jesus died by crucifixion. What's the significance of everything we've talked about right now? It shows that our starting point is Jesus was most definitely dead, all right? That first fact is very well founded. He was crucified, he died. Any theory that tries to explain what happened 2,000 years ago has to start from the premise that Jesus did in fact die.
Do you think they still carry out cross hanging in Jerusalem?
In Jerusalem, no, but there are places in the world, especially in Islamic countries, that do it. We just had a mass crucifixion. I don't want to speak out of terms of remember which country it was. I want to say it was Saudi Arabia, but I could be mistaken, within the past 30 days. Yeah, so yes, crucifixion still happened in the world. All right, moving on to the second fact, that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Remember we talked about early attestation, multiple attestation. Again, we have here that it is in all 4 Gospels. Mentioned that he was buried in a known tomb, the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And this was touched on in the documentary, so I won't take too much time with it. But that is not something they would have made up. Keep in mind the relationship between the Jewish authorities and the early Christian church was not, shall we say, hunky-dory. The early Jewish authorities were not exactly accepting of Christians as another sect, a viable sect of Judaism. I mean, you had the the Pharisees, you had the Sadducees, you had the Essenes, you had these different groups of Jews that were still considered part of Judaism. Christians were not. All right. The Gospels talk about that the entire Sanhedrin is the way they put it. Now that could be a colloquialism in the sense, it might not literally mean every single one, but still, by and large, the Sanhedrin sentenced him to death, and they were the ones that they were blaming for it. So again, if you're going to make up a story about his burial and somebody doing the right thing by him, because the other thing you need to know about, and I think I might have a slide about this coming up, is that typically speaking, crucifixion victims were not buried. They were left on the cross to rot. All right? Now, there was an exception for Jews, which I think we'll talk about in a second, but somebody still decided, hey, I'm going to do what's right by Jesus, and I'm going to give him a proper burial. If you're making that up, are you going to make it a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin who does that? Not likely, all right? Not likely. Because again, that counts against you. Because somebody, look at it from the eyes of someone at the time. They're going to hear you saying with one breath that the Jewish Sanhedrin was against him and they wanted him to die and they sentenced him to death. Oh, but it was somebody from the Jewish Sanhedrin that actually buried him. Yeah, okay, that doesn't make me look so good, all right? It counts against their other arguments, at least when viewed through the eyes of someone at the time. So it's an embarrassing detail that wouldn't have been made up. The other things you need to know about it is there is no other burial tradition out there. There are no historic documents anywhere that say anything different. All right? Nobody even comes up with an alternative explanation, even a ridiculous one. All right? It just doesn't exist. And also remember that 1 Corinthians Creed we talked about, which was the earliest evidence of some of what the early Christians believed. The fact that Jesus was at least buried and not left on the cross is included in there as well. Now, this is what I was talking about. I just had a discussion. I think I mentioned this actually in an earlier class. I had a recent online discussion with a skeptic who challenged me on this point and said that no, that the Romans Jesus wouldn't have been buried because Romans left the bodies on the cross to rot. And I pointed out to him, first of all, the same passage of Deuteronomy that I read to you earlier that said that it was considered leaving someone on the cross was considered to be a curse on the land. Jews were not to defile the land, so they were supposed to take them down and bury them before sunset, all right? Because to leave that corpse rotting was considered to be defiling the Holy Land. But that's the Jewish law, and they were under Roman authority at the time, so maybe the Romans didn't allow them to do that. But that's when you get into Josephus again. Josephus is our best friend, even though he's not a Christian. We still love him because he provides a lot of good historical evidence. This is even an earlier work. This is from his work, The Jewish Wars, which predates the other, the Antiquities of the Jews that I talked about earlier. And what he said in that, there's a quote, he says, Jews are conscientious about their burial practices, so much so that even criminals sentenced to crucifixion are removed and buried before the sun sets. So this Josephus confirming that, yes, in fact, the Roman authorities did allow, even though normally they wouldn't, they did allow the Jews, probably as an accommodation because, let's face it, one of the things Pontius Pilate was always worried about was, not resurrection, he might have been worried about that too if he knew it was coming, but insurrection, all right? He's far removed from the central authority of Rome, all right? And he's charged with keeping the peace here in this outlier land of Judea. And so one of the ways you keep the peace is not to push buttons you don't have to push. And this is one of those examples where they did actually allow them to, crucifixion victims to be taken down and to be buried. So this is our second fact. What's the significance of this second fact? The location of the body was publicly known so that it could have been easily retrieved if necessary. You're starting to see the case building here as you look at the historical facts. Number 3, on the third day, the tomb was empty. Again, early and multiple attestation. It's in all 4 Gospels. It's also in that 1 Corinthians creed we talked about. And this is where that criteria of embarrassment comes in again. Who were the first witnesses of the empty tomb?
Women.
The women. You're going to make that up if you're making up a story? No, not 2,000 years ago you're not. Because again, if you're making up a story in that culture, just like if you're making up a story, let's say you're a criminal and you're caught by the police nowadays and you want to get your story straight, right? You want to think of a story. Well, are you going to try to think of a story that they're more likely to believe or one they're more likely not to believe? I mean, your concern is the here and now. You want to come up with a story that those police officers right then are going to believe and they're going to let you go, all right? Anybody ever been pulled over for speeding and tried to talk their way out of it? No, I'm not going to ask you to answer that one either, but all right? We'll always fess up and tell the truth, right? Right, all right. But that's the point, is at the time, the testimony of a woman was not considered worth much at all. And so if you're going to have your first witnesses to the empty tomb be anybody, it's not going to be women, all right? And yet, it was. And it was in multiple documents, and the church stuck with that story over time. They had no incentive to stick to that story unless it was true. The book of Acts, which was also written by Luke, the same author who wrote the Gospel of Luke, records the early church preaching the resurrection. The early Christians are talking about the resurrection in Jerusalem within about 7 weeks after Jesus' death. Well, if the location of his burial is a matter of public knowledge and the tomb wasn't empty, well, then they've got some gumption. You got to say that, because all it would take is one person to go down to the tomb and pull out a body and say, excuse me? So again, this is again further what might be called circumstantial evidence that the tomb actually was empty. And again, there is no historical record anywhere of anyone even claimed to have produced a body or have attempted to produce a body. Every single record we see that discusses early Christianity at all seems to assume that the tomb was in fact empty. Also, another interesting thing, in Jesus' day, there were about 50 tombs of prominent Jews that were venerated. This was kind of a Jewish custom, is that they would honor where some prominent Jewish leader was buried. All right? Guess what? And keep in mind, the early Christians were Jews. That's who they were. And yet there's no record of them venerating a tomb. All right? Why? Because they didn't think there was a tomb where Jesus' body was located. Also, how did the early Jews respond to it? Well, we have this record in Matthew that says, when the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." What does that story assume? It assumes the tomb is empty, doesn't it? Kind of went to the next slide too early. But it says, you're to say that his disciples came in the night and stole him away. Well, if you've got to claim that the disciples came and stole him away, you wouldn't have to claim that if there was a body in the tomb. And again, some people will say this was biased because this is, the early Christians who have an agenda. We've already talked about that somewhat. But the fact of the matter is, again, there is no alternative explanation offered. All right. As a matter of fact, if you look at the early church fathers, even in the 2nd century, Justin Martyr, they mentioned Tertullian, they're reporting that this is still what the Jews are saying even in their day. They're claiming that the body was stolen. There's no record in any historical document, whether it be Josephus or anybody else, of any other explanation, of anybody saying, no, the body was there. It doesn't exist. Nobody at the time was claiming the body was there. All right. What's the significance of this third fact? Any potential explanation that comes for what happened 2,000 years ago now must also account for the fact that, number one, Jesus was genuinely dead and buried, yet shortly thereafter, the body was missing from the tomb. You've got to come up with an explanation. So he really died, the body was really gone. All right? The last fact, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus, that we have individuals and groups of people who did genuinely believe that Jesus did, in fact, come back to life. All right? The New Testament lists 12 separate appearances of Jesus over the course of 40 days, and these range, they're all on the screen as far as who he appeared to, and as you can see, they range from appearing to individual people to as many as 500 at a time. All right? So we have groups of 10, groups of 7, and groups of 500, and a bunch of individual cases as well. All right? Now, you need to understand, again, the Jewish culture at the time. Even those Jews, and some Jews denied a resurrection at all. Right? They didn't think that there ever was a resurrection. But even those Jews who did believe that there was some type of resurrection that was going to occur, they believed, number one, that it wasn't going to happen until the end of time. All right? And number two, that it was going to be a large en masse situation where, bunches of people are going to be resurrected at the end of days. The idea of one isolated individual coming back to life in the course of human history was completely foreign to their theology at the time. So we've got, for some reason, a good number of Jewish people who have this type of mindset. Something happens to make them change it, all right? To make them all of a sudden start preaching something, and we'll talk about the consequences of their preaching here in a second, to start preaching something that runs completely contrary to that. That says, no, this one isolated individual came back to life in the course of human history. And again, let's talk about the resurrection. Who are the primary witnesses of the resurrection? Who are the first ones to see not just the empty tomb, mind you, but now to see the risen Christ? It's women again. First of all, anybody who tells you the Bible doesn't hold women in a very high regard has never read their Bible, okay? Women are the primary witnesses of the most important historical events in the Bible. All the women in the room are smiling at me now. Look at that. It's like, that's right, because they know that we women are reliable. You men, forget about it. You don't even know where you put your left sock, right? The men aren't laughing. All the women are laughing at that. But again, we have women as the primary witnesses of the resurrection. And again, also keep going back to that 1 Corinthians Creed, because that's the earliest source we have. It also recites multiple resurrection appearances. So we know this was a very early belief of the Christian church. Within anywhere from 2 to 7 years of Jesus' crucifixion, the early Christians believed he had appeared resurrected to multiple people. The group of 500, for example, the biggest one, that's in that creed. All right? And the whole point is, Paul at that time is saying that he appeared to these group of 500. A lot of them are still alive. You don't believe me, go ask them. Right? Again, take some gumption if it ain't true. The other thing to know, I've mentioned that the apostles go about and they keep preaching this, even though they're claiming that it was appearance to women, even though it ran counter to everything that their theology led them to believe up to that point in time. And they preached it until what? Well, according to the early church fathers, all the disciples except John ended up being martyred for their faith, meaning killed. All right? Up till that point, and you can look at Paul's writings and see some of this, up till that point, we're talking about them being imprisoned, being stoned. This was not a pleasant life they were living. All right? Now, it's not just Christian sources. I've seen a number of people try to challenge me on this and say, again, the same thing. Well, you can't believe those early church or early Christian fathers because, they're Christians, and so we need to throw that out. Well, not entirely. Well, first of all, even if you look at the other sources about what was going on and how Christians were being treated, it certainly is consistent with what we see in outside Christian sources that the early Christian fathers would have been killed. But we also have some records. Like here's in Josephus, our best friend Josephus we keep talking about, also does record the stoning of James, Jesus' brother James. That's recorded in Josephus' history. Tacitus records Emperor Nero blaming Christians for the great fire in Rome that happened around 64 AD. He actually wrote, consequently, the report is talking about people are trying to blame Nero for it, basically, and so he wants to cast blame away from himself. And so consequently, to get rid of this report, the report that Nero might be responsible for the fire himself, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. This is recording an event that happened in 64 AD, only about 30 years after Jesus died. All right, we have an event where the historian, a Roman historian, is telling us that a Roman leader inflicted the most exquisite tortures on Christians as kind of scapegoats at that point, to blame them for the fire. So again, that shows it's very consistent with what we see, in other words, in the surrounding evidence. Even when it doesn't specifically mention, and Paul was martyred for his faith. What we see is, well, wait a minute. If the early church fathers report that Paul was martyred for his faith, and we know that the surrounding environment was one in which this kind of stuff was being done to Christians, is it really that hard to believe that Paul probably really was martyred for his faith? And even if he wasn't, we have the most exquisite tortures being initiated upon them. All right. Now, this is why this is important. A lot of people will look at this type of thing and say, wait a minute. People die for false beliefs all the time. Insert your favorite or least favorite cult leader here, okay? And you will see instances where some cult leader has led a lot of people astray, and they have died because of the teachings of that cult leader for something that turned out to be completely false. All right. Is that really analogous to what's happening here? And the answer is no. Here's why. There is a difference between dying for something you believe to be true, but don't really have any firsthand knowledge of. You may sincerely believe it, but it's not something you personally witnessed. And dying for something that you are the one person who knows for sure whether it's true or not. Keep in mind what the apostles were saying. They weren't dying because of something Jesus told them. They were dying because they say, I personally saw him. All right? That's a huge difference. Because if it's not true, guess what? They're the ones who would know. And so if they are making all this up, despite everything we've seen so far about how incredibly implausible that is, if they are making this up, are they really going to be willing to die for something they know to be a lie? Are they willing to be tortured for something they know to be a lie? It's a huge difference between the two. Really quickly, I want to try to wrap through this because we're actually almost there. We're on slide 42 out of 48. We're really almost there, believe me. Bear with me for a second, because this is one of the leading explanations, all right? Another way people try to explain these postmortem explanations is hallucinations. They try to say we acknowledge they genuinely believed that Jesus risen from the dead, but it was a hallucination, all right? There's a lot of problems with that. First of all, the scriptures record multiple events where it wasn't just an isolated person. Okay, there were several people all together, all at once, were reporting the same appearance, all right? The same vision, if that's what you want to call it, all right? Group hallucinations of that nature are, even being generous, extremely rare, if not outright impossible, all right? There's not a psychic link between 10, 12, 500 people's brains that's going to have them all seeing the same thing. Second, hallucinations generally come about as a result of intense wish fulfillment. You see what you want to be true, all right? When we see the disciples' first reaction to the risen Christ, it's not, yay, just what I always wanted, especially Thomas. It's disbelief. It's surprise. When the women come and report to Peter and John that the tomb is empty, what's their reaction? They don't believe them. All right? So we have no record that this was their mindset going in that would account for a hallucination. Furthermore, neither James nor Paul were followers of Jesus. Why would they hallucinate a resurrected Christ? They didn't believe in him. Paul was persecuting Christians. He certainly was not inclined to hallucinate what happened on the road to Damascus. And obviously, it's unlikely, if you have that appearance to 500 people, it's really unlikely that all 500 people had the same wishes and desires and were set up for mass hallucinations.
Especially then.
Yeah, exactly. Third, just statistically speaking, all right, about hallucinations, only about 7% of seniors who, for example, who lose a loved one, experience a grief hallucination. Yet, if this explanation is to be believed, 100% of the disciples experienced one. That's not all that likely either. Fourth, for all of these people who have experienced a hallucination, this kind of ties into what we've seen before. This is the way I put it in a recent paper I had to write, or a quiz, I can't remember what it was. The region truly must have experienced an epidemic of mental illness that was coincidentally uniform and remarkably convenient in its timing. What a conveniently placed outbreak of hallucinations. Fifth, and this is where we're wrapping it up. It gets back to those foundational facts. Even if it was a hallucination, it simply fails to explain the minimal facts. Even if you want to evaluate whether or not it was a hallucination, rather, look at those minimal facts that historians agree are true. Jesus died by crucifixion. He was buried in a known tomb. That tomb was subsequently empty, and many people experienced what they sincerely believed to be post-mortem appearances. At best, this hallucination theory is consistent with numbers 1 and 4, but it fails to account for 2 and 3. Even if it was a hallucination, it does not account for the fact that he was buried in a known tomb and that tomb was empty. A hallucination does not steal a body from a tomb, all right? So you can't explain all the facts. So put it all together, wrapping it all up. You've got your 4 facts. Start from the premise that all 4 of these are true. The majority of historians accept them as true, and hopefully I've given you at least a quick taste in the time we've had here of why they believe those are true, and it's very well founded. Anytime someone comes up with a theory, whether it be the swoon theory, he didn't really die, whether it be the hallucination theory, they're just hallucinations, look down, compare that theory to these 4 facts, and see if that theory is true, is it possible for that theory to be true and these 4 facts to also be true? Does it really explain everything we need to explain in these 4 facts? And what you see are the competing theories don't. They don't explain all 4 facts. We've talked about 3 different theories tonight: the resurrection, swoon theory, and hallucinations. And that's just 3. We don't have a lot of time to go through everything, but out of those 3, you can see only one is the inference to the best explanation, explains all 4 facts, and that is that he really did rise from the dead. So I ask you to ponder this. If those 4 facts really are historical, if they really are true, what else can explain them? What happened 2,000 years ago? I think there's only one reasonable explanation for how those 4 things can be true. Next week, the moral argument for the existence of God and the problem of evil. It's going to be a fun one, all right? Yeah?
I have a question about, so I was watching this National Geographic special on the Shroud.
Yes.
So have they been able to prove that that was real?
There's a loaded question. The question is, has the Shroud of Turin been demonstrated to be real? You want my personal opinion? No. I don't think so. I would at least say the verdict is out on it. It is entirely possible, but there have been, and again, I don't have all my stuff in front of me right now, so forgive me if I get some of the details wrong, but it is my understanding they have done some carbon dating on at least one. At some point they got permission to get one little piece to do carbon dating of it, and the carbon dating didn't come back old enough to be. Now, carbon dating is not perfect, of course, and as we've even seen, and we talked about the carbon dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls, even then it gave you a pretty wide range. So it's not perfect. So I wouldn't, the way you asked the question, has it been shown to be true? And so I'm answering it that way. Has it been demonstrated to be definitely the shroud that Jesus was buried in? I would say no. I don't think it's been demonstrated, at least to my satisfaction, that it definitely is. That is not the same thing as saying that it was not the shroud that he was buried in. And I certainly see that there's a lot of arguments from people, plausible arguments. And you see some of the questions about how the image got put on there. And you've seen some of the attempts to duplicate how that image got, I'm going to use the word burned, just for lack of a better word, onto that shroud. And it is very interesting, to say the least. And so I do not fault anybody that said that was the shroud that he was buried in. But I don't think you're going to get too much headway with skeptics based on that. In other words, there hasn't been strong enough scientific confirmation of the age of the shroud that you're going to be able to use that to a skeptic and say, hey, look, this shows that the crucifixion. But the other thing is the placement of the wounds and the nails on there matches up perfectly, yeah.
You'd have to prove the stain that was that old, too.
I'm sorry?
You know, the blood, you'd have to prove that the blood on it.
Right, and to be honest, it's the Vatican has control of it. I can't remember which church it's in off the top of my head. Or where if it's even in a church on display where it's being kept, I don't recall. But they're hesitant to allow too much experimentation on it. And I mean, because frankly, any kind of experimentation is going to do damage to it, all right? And so I understand that too, but it does make it a little bit more complicated to verify. So, anything else? Somebody's gonna watch this video later and probably gonna get a whole bunch of comments. They're gonna say, the shroud is absolutely genuine, Ken, you're delirious. And it may be, I'm not saying it's not. I just wanna be clear about it, I'm not saying it's not. I just haven't been entirely convinced just yet, yeah.
Yeah, I hate to use the word scheme, but in the grand picture of all this evidence, where does faith fit in?
Good question. Let me give you an analogy that I use an awful lot to explain. A lot of people misunderstand what the Bible means by faith. And there are people who challenge this whole apologetic endeavor. And they'll say that, no, you just got to believe. Faith is belief with lack of evidence. Well, if that's true, then the most faithful people would be the people that believe something even though there's all sorts of evidence against it that tells you shouldn't believe it. And I don't think that's where we want to go with it. But the Bible actually speaks of faith more in terms of trust. All right. The example I give is when my son was younger. He's 11 years old now, so thankfully he does not, well, he still kind of does do this actually, but just not from the steps. But he used to stand on the steps in our front foyer, and he'd be like on the third or fourth step up, and my back would be turned. All right? And all of a sudden I'd hear, Daddy! I turn around and he's already mid-air jumping toward me, expecting me to catch him. Now, was that, in other words, he had faith that I would catch him. It's faith in, not faith that. He had faith in me. Now, was that a blind faith? No, because he'd done this dozens of times before and I'd always caught him. So he had very good reason to believe that I would be able to catch him, but he still had to make the leap, all right? And my daughter was actually asking me on the way here, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, we were talking, and she asked me, how do people look at this stuff and not come to believe it? And we were talking about that a little bit, and that's kind of the point, is God gives us enough to through general revelation. I think that goes back to, I think, class number 1. We talked about general revelation, just looking at the world around us. He gives us enough to justify that leap, but he doesn't give us enough to compel belief. There's not enough out there to force you to believe. You still got to take that step. And so that's where faith interacts with all this.
In I think it's the 11th chapter of Hebrews, Paul defines faith, and then further down in the chapter, he says, without it, you can't please God.
Right. Well, and don't you see how that interacts with trust? How you've got to, God wants us to trust him. He wants us to have faith in him. Look at the book of Job, for example. It's a prime example of that, all right, where Job was not privy to everything that was going on and why he was suffering all these things. Sometimes we're not going to know the answer. God's infinite. We're not. We're not going to understand everything and the reasons that he allows things to happen, etc. And so we have to trust him. And so you're right. It's impossible to please him without faith, because faith means trusting in God. He's giving you enough to take that leap, but you still got to take it. So, anything else? Great question.
From this lecture, I didn't think you added, maybe I was gone at the time, but after he died, miracles still happen.
I'm sorry, say it again?
Miracles still happen after he died.
Yes.
That he said were going to happen.
Well, miracles don't, God uses miracles sometimes to verify a message is from him, and that wasn't exclusively limited to Jesus.
I mean, the tarp was torn from the top to the bottom.
Right.
Right? Okay, number two, the temple was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
Not a stone was left standing. He said that would happen. It did. So.
Right. He predicted that the temple was going to be torn down.
So I don't know how you can argue against that's just more evidence toward it.
Matter of fact, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a real key piece of evidence a lot of people object to. You'll notice the Gospels mention Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple, but they don't mention the destruction of the temple. This is really key for a lot of people who try to claim that these things were written later. They weren't written by the original authors. They were written sometime in the 2nd century. If Jesus predicted something and it actually happened, especially you look at the book of Matthew. Matthew, we talked about this a little bit last week. Matthew's whole approach was prophecy fulfillment, prophecy fulfillment, prophecy fulfillment. If Jesus prophesied the temple was going to be destroyed, and it did in fact happen before Matthew wrote his gospel, then he's going to say prophecy fulfillment, just like he has for everything else. But none of the Gospels mention that the temple actually was destroyed, which indicates that they were written before it was destroyed, which helps us not only date them, but also provides further evidence that this was a genuine prophecy, and like you're saying, provides further evidence that Jesus was who he said he was, because he prophesied something that happened after he died. All right? He couldn't have known about it beforehand. It didn't happen until 70 AD is when the temple was destroyed. So yeah, it's another good point.
He prophesied his own death.
Mm-hmm.
He knew it was going to happen. He knew how it was going to happen. He asked God if there was any other way to fulfill this. Can it be done?
Mm-hmm.
There was no other way. Why would you go through an excruciating death like that, knowing it's going to happen, if it wasn't valid, if it wasn't...
You know what I find, and this gets into next week's class somewhat, but I find that actually provides comfort in times of pain and suffering. Because I mentioned earlier, we were talking before the class started a little bit about this, about, I don't necessarily think that, somewhat could be misleading to say, well, God has a plan for everything. I don't necessarily think that God, takes evil action in order to bring good results. But he can use evil action and bring about something good from it. Human beings can freely choose to do something wrong, and then God can turn that around into something good. And the prime example of that is Jesus' crucifixion. I mean, you're right. Why would he choose to do that?
He could have avoided it so easily. Just stop saying I'm the Son of God.
I'm sorry?
Just stop saying I'm God, and he could
Right.
avoid the whole thing.
And the devil tempted him to do that, just stop saying you're the Son of God, and then you can spare yourself all of this. But he doesn't do it, because there was an ultimate good that was going to come from it. So Jesus allowed the free choice of human beings on this earth to run their course and to do to him what he knew they were going to do to him, because he knew he was going to use it for greater good down the line. But it wasn't easy. That Garden of Gethsemane is a powerful moment, really powerful moment. So, anything else? All right, great. Hopefully I fulfilled my promise, and you saw the evidence for the resurrection really is very strong. All right, see you all next week. We'll talk more about evil. Hey, thanks for watching. Trinity Lutheran Church can be found at 1100 Philadelphia Road in Joppa, Maryland. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you like this video, go ahead and click the like button. That's a thumbs up button right here on the YouTube page. And you could also be a big help to us if you'd go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you very much, and God bless.